Welcome everybody to this webinar on Ignatian discernment and consumption. I'm Andrew Hansen Quintana. I'm an ISN staff member. I'm a big fan of the Catholic Ethical Purchasing Alliance, CEPA, and it's because it's just so solidly grounded on Catholic social teaching. So it brings me great joy to weave in some particular aspects of Ignatian spirituality into this individual practice of ethical purchasing of ethical purchasing. So let's get to it. So first, the emerging papacy of Pope Leo the 14th allows us to look back on the papacy of Pope Francis with a new lens of gratitude, especially for the moral voice he brought and the importance of caring for our common home. And so what comes to mind for many people when they think about caring for our common home is reducing their carbon footprint through energy that they're using in their homes and vehicles and their air travels, etc. So does that resonate with you? You know, what about your clothes? Does that come to mind when you think about reducing your carbon footprint? Well, according to the UN Environment Program, the fast fashion industry is the second biggest consumer of water and is responsible for about 10% of global carbon emissions. That's more than all international flights and maritime shipping combined. 10%. And unfortunately, the fast fashion industry's problems, which we'll get into briefly a little bit into this webinar, they're often overlooked by consumers and admittedly, even myself. So, in this CEPA webinar, we're going to take a loving look at our clothing purchasing decisions, using a couple of the time tested tools of Ignatian spirituality to help us navigate this aspect of our moral call to care for the dignity of the planet and the people who literally put the clothes on our backs. This year is Laudato Si's 10th anniversary. It's arguably Pope Francis's most famous encyclical, but all of Pope Francis's encyclicals, plus all the encyclicals that the past century plus of popes have written, this makes up the living body of Catholic social teaching upon which we rely to contextualize the timeless teachings of Christianity and the church in an ever changing world. So, what we're going to do is we're just going to whip through a very brief overview on Catholic social teaching and what it says on about workers and the environment. So, modern Catholic social teaching got underway with Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, which addresses the working class's condition and employers' moral obligation to observe the inherent dignity of laborers. So, our current Pope Leo mentioned that Pope Leo XIII was a major reason why he chose the name Leo. So, we can expect the richness of Catholic social teaching and the importance of the rights of workers to deepen over Pope Leo XIV's pontificate. And as Catholic social teaching has deepened, the rights of workers continue to be a focal point as this idol of profit leads corporations to exploit workers and the planet everywhere. The worshippers of this cult of money, as Pope Francis once termed it, cult of money, that's a strong term, and I'm for it. They don't just stop at exploiting workers. Everything is fair game for profit and for exploitation to feed this insatiable hunger for money. And that includes the natural environment and natural resources. So the church in this long arc of Catholic social teaching, it beginning more or less with Pope St. John Paul II, he emphasized that environmental degradation was a moral crisis. And so that began to emerge with Pope John Paul II. Then Pope Benedict XVI continued the church's centering of environmental care, and he became known as the Green Pope, going so far as to explicitly label certain things as sins. And I'm going to quote them as he said them. So, quote, the destruction of the environment, excessive wealth, and the creation of poverty. He explicitly called those three things sins. And then, as I briefly mentioned, Pope Francis, his papacy kind of changed the game and took it to a whole new level. So, integral ecology. This is a key concept within Pope Francis's encyclical of Laudato Si. and it pushes against the conventional boundaries of the environmental discourse. This term unfolds as the encyclical's core response to the links between social and environmental issues. In the words of Pope Francis, as you can see here in this slide, quote, nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. So as a result, integral ecology recognizes that our interactions with the environment are woven into the fabric of economic, political, social, cultural, and ethical dimensions. And as recently as January of this year, 2025, Pope Francis explicitly touched upon this interconnectedness as it pertained to unjust practices behind the products we purchase. So, addressing a general audience who had gathered to learn from him in a catechetical exhortation, he lamented the reality of child labor and forced labor, and he exhorted the individuals and institutions to become more aware of where their food and products come from in order not to be complicit in injustice, right? And I think that's an important operating word, the complicitness, because there are those that are actively committing an injustice, and then there are those who, whether through ignorance or through knowing, even though they might not be the ones exploiting the workers themselves, they're complicit by participating in this system, right? So let me quote Pope Francis for you. He said, "quote And so we ask ourselves, what can I do? Well, first of all, we must recognize that if we want to eradicate child labor, we cannot be complicit in it. And when is this the case? For example, when we purchase products that involve child labor. How can we eat and dress knowing that behind that food and those garments there are exploited children who work instead of going to school? Find out where those products come from. Awareness of what we purchase is a first act in order not to be complicit. Some will say that as individuals, we cannot do much. True, but each one can be a drop that, together with many other drops, can become a sea. However, institutions, including church institutions and companies, must also be reminded of their responsibility. They can make a difference by shifting their investments. More can be done. Here, and then he went on in this quote, in this exhortation, he says, I also urge journalists, there are some journalists here, to do their part. They can help raise awareness of the problem and help find solutions. Do not be afraid. Denounce these things. End quote. So some pretty powerful words by Pope Francis that really call us to become a little bit more aware. And in terms of fast fashion, right, we're consuming 400% more clothing in the last 20 years than ever before. The world of fashion has changed significantly, with the focus being on clothing that is cheap and disposable, so consumers can keep up with the weekly changing trends. And again, this is termed fast fashion. And most of us, most consumers, we've grown accustomed to buying a $10 t-shirt without knowing that there's a hidden cost. And what are some of those hidden costs? What are some of those hidden costs? Looks like stolen wages of the worker, the weight that the planet carries from the production of that t-shirt, as you can see in this image there, just a whole dumping ground of clothes that have been discarded. And with these hidden costs, we have to look deeper at the issues people and the planet face because of our purchasing decisions. And this is where the practice of discernment can be a helpful tool. So, all of that is an introduction, right? As an introduction to really briefly get us to this point of how can Ignatian spirituality be used as a tool for ethical purchasing? Okay, so I'm gonna give a couple of things. Some aspects of Ignatian spirituality, these a couple of key components and their application and how they can sort of frame our orientation towards our purchases and how we can use them in our small discernments about what we're purchasing. So in Ignatian spirituality relies heavily on the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. So as such, we're going to look at those cornerstones that you see there, those key components. The first one being the principle and foundation. So this is sort of, it's just that. It's the foundation upon which Ignatius builds these exercises, right? And it's an orientation. It's a life philosophy. It is an exercise that orients a person that's about to undergo the spiritual exercises as a retreat, as a 30-day silent retreat, or as a retreat in their daily lives. So I'm going to read a sort of a modern translation of it so that we can get a sense of this is the foundation upon which we should make our life decisions, both like the big ones, but also maybe the everyday ones like our purchases too. So it reads, the goal of our life is to live with God forever. God, who loves us, gave us life. Our own response of love allows God's life to flow into us without limit. All the things in this world are gifts of God presented to us so that we can know God more easily and make a return of love more readily. As a result, we appreciate and use all these gifts of God insofar as they help us develop as loving persons. But if any of these gifts become the center of our lives, they displace God and so hinder our growth toward our goal. In everyday life, then, we must hold ourselves in balance before all these created gifts, insofar as we have a choice and are not bound by some obligation. We should not fix our desires on health or sickness, wealth or poverty, success or failure, a long life or a short one. For everything has the potential of calling forth in us a deeper response to our life in God. Our only desire and our one choice should be this: I want and I choose what better leads to God's deepening his life in me. So that was the Jesuit David Fleming's modern translation of the principle and foundation. It's very beautiful. And if we can just, go back to that every day in the way that we carry ourselves, I think the world would be a much better place. But this orientation presents everything as gifts from God. Our relationships, our talents, even our material possessions. And so, since purchasing is the acquisition of something, if we relate to it as a gift from God that is meant to help us with this in this overall life goal of loving and serving God, then that product or purchase is going to go to great use and will be appreciated. So part of the problem with this 400% increase in our consumption of clothing over the last couple of decades is that we don't appreciate the material goods and the story that each of them has. All of our clothing came from somewhere. And I think we just had a slide that said that, 35 plus people on average touch our clothes before we get to them. That's a lot of story. There's a lot of people. Those are a lot of stories, right? Excuse me. So all of our clothing came from somewhere. Someone grew the natural products behind the item. Other people assembled them, put them together, distributed them, etc. Right? So without knowing their story and where they come from, how can we fully appreciate them as gifts that many different people and ideas and materials are behind? So this principle and foundation, it's such an important disposition to have because it gives us this openness, or as Ignatius would say, this freedom, this interior freedom to use it or to let it go insofar as they help us or hinder us in our ultimate desire and goal of being with God. And so, how easy it is for us to get caught up wearing the newest things because they're a good deal or they're the newest trend or they just feel good to purchase, right? It's so easy to get caught up in that. And the principle and foundation provides us a good check-in question with ourselves when we're discerning a purchase of whether to go forward with it or whether to let something go and let it have another life. So maybe we wouldn't even have to have this conversation and this webinar if all garment and clothing purchasing was ethical, right? It wouldn't really matter so much the reason behind your purchase because it's not detrimental to other people's lives and it's not detrimental to the earth. But that's certainly not the case, unfortunately. So therefore, in order to make sure that the discernment of our purchasing is something that is not disordered and pulling us away from God, we have to be aware of where our desires are rooted. Desires are such an important part of Ignatian spirituality. St. Ignatius, the pilgrim, understood that life is just a great pilgrimage towards God. And oftentimes in that pilgrimage, we are prompted along and guided by the Holy Spirit. And other times we deviate from this path in this pilgrimage towards God by our own human sinfulness and what he calls disordered affections or disordered desires. And they impact all people. So St. Ignatius suggests that people be aware of their present condition, the ground where they are standing, and the direction in which they are moving. This awareness helps them realize the disordered affections which are drawing them away from the direction of God. So the first discernment before making a purchase is knowing where you are grounded in your desire for that purchase. And two terms that are really key in Ignatian spirituality are consolation and desolations. And those are the two general states of our soul, and they determine the ground from which we are making decisions. In St. Ignatius's native Spanish, consuelo, right? Consolation, consuelo, it literally means, if you break up the word, with ground. So to be grounded is consuelo. And then desolation is that opposite, right? So when you're experiencing consolation, you're grounded in that ultimate purpose, God. Now we're not going to dig too deep into consolation and desolation because that's just a deep dive. There's a lot of amazing resources out there about, because it's such a key part of Ignatian spirituality. But we'll just give a quick working definition of both of those terms. So consolation is a state of being where one feels a sense of God's closeness and is full of faith, hope, and love. A person experiencing consolation has peace and tranquility, is full of healthy desires, interacts with others transparently and openly. And desolation is consolation's opposite. In desolation, the soul is restless, agitated, full of fear or worry, and tends toward secrecy and apathy. In desolation, one feels a lack of faith, hope, and love, and also feels far from God. It's important to say that these two terms, they don't equal happiness and sadness respectively, right? It's more complex than just feeling good or feeling down. But when you are in consolation, the grace and contentedness of that state of being, it allows you to be more honest with yourself when you're questioning maybe why you might want to make a purchase. If you ask yourself the question, do I really need this, from a place of consolation, you're likely to be just a little bit more free, or as Ignatius would say, indifferent about the response, right? Your honest response to yourself and to that question. Do I really need this? All right. But if you feel funky and you're in desolation, you know, that clouds your clarity about what best serves your relationship with God. So it's harder to be truly free with your self-examination because insecurity is a natural symptom of desolation. And insecurity, it does just that. It makes us feel less secure about ourselves and our belovedness to God. And that perceived gap, that void that comes with desolation, that distance between you and God, it gets tempting to fill that with superficial things like fast fashion purchases. So Ignatius is pretty clear in his rules for discernment about what decisions we should make when we're in desolation. Nothing. No decisions. Don't make any major decisions. Don't make any major changes. That's rule 5 of his 14 general rules for discernment. Now, a clothing purchase, is hardly ever a major life decision, right? But in the same way that we can use faulty logic when we're making big decisions from a place of desolation, our disordered attachments can definitely come into play when we're in our everyday purchasing decisions. So think about the term retail therapy, right? It's a way to describe the act of purchasing to make you feel better when you're not feeling good, or to mask feelings that would take a little bit of work to process. So this is all part of this what the fast fashion industry depends on, is people not questioning whether they really need something or whether they're trying to fill a void by making these purchases. Um, let's get clear on why we buy things, and this is a major oversimplification. So we're going to put this into a few different camps, right? We have there's a lot of reasons to buy things, especially clothing, but really one of those camps is necessity, right? We need clothes, we need to wear clothes, and so maybe you got a new job and you need new professional clothes. Maybe you just moved to a different climate and your wardrobe needs to reflect that. Even the most frugal person will eventually wear out their clothes and they will need to buy replacements. So there's necessity there. We also make purchases out of generosity. Sometimes we want to purchase things as a gift for others. Maybe it's a special occasion, or maybe it's just a love language. Sometimes we buy things, right? Like Girl Scout cookies, not because we really need them, but because we know that the purchase helps towards a good cause. And then in this last camp, I'm going to put together the right reasons why we buy things: vanity and boredom. Right? Sometimes we try something on and we just like the way it makes us feel, or we're bored. And sometimes we buy things for no real reason at all. That can certainly be the case when we're online shopping or we're scrolling and there's some targeted ad that seems to have us all figured out. We're like, wow, yeah, and it just seems something so appealing to buy, even though it's not something we need. And maybe, we're, again, retail therapy. We're trying to fill something there that really material things can't fill. So obviously these categories, they have overlaps with each other, right? When you're buying something you need, it's natural to have some vain considerations when you decide between options. Oh, this looks better on me, so I'm going to go with this one. Excuse me. Sometimes you're a little bored and you end up making a purchase not for yourself, but for someone else, right? So boredom and generosity kind of overlap in that case. But by separating these things out into a couple different categories, maybe it'll make it a little bit easier to find clarity and to be honest with yourself as you discern a clothing purchase. So suffice it to say that it's probably best to refrain from purchasing if your desire to purchase something is in this boredom or vanity camp, right? Um, so let's kind of dive a little bit more deeper into these other two camps of necessity and generosity, and they kind of those two even meld together a little bit. So if your desire to purchase something is grounded in necessity or generosity, consider the following questions to ensure that your purchases do not come with the detrimental impacts of fast fashion. So first is just to be clear with yourself: why am I purchasing this item? Right? Is this something that I can reuse in the future? Is this a one-time purchase? How can I find out about the people behind this item that I want to purchase? Uh, One thing that our CEPA colleague, Grace Adams, has put together is this brilliant flow chart for your discernment in purchasing. So make sure to use that resource so that it can guide you through this individual discernment to help you clarify where this desire for a purchase is coming from. So a couple of important considerations alongside those just general questions to ask yourself, right? The cheaper option, it's not always the more ethical option. So in fact, it rarely is. Prices are not just determined based on the weight of the brand of the item. Okay, yes, brands often arbitrarily increase the price of an item based on their social leverage. So personally, if I'm discerning between a $200 Patagonia backpack or an equitable, similar $150 backpack from some other brand, I wouldn't be so quick to choose the cheaper option unless I'm clear that that other company makes honest and intentional efforts behind values that prioritize the earth and the well-being of the people behind their products. And so just to be transparent, like this is not a Patagonia sponsored video. I'm not promoting the purchases of Patagonia's products above other products, but I'm promoting companies of which Patagonia happens to be one, that really takes seriously the quality of their product, the impact on the earth, and the absence of human or environmental exploitation in the creation of those products. Uh, One thing, it sounds like a lot of work. I'll have to do so much, research before I make any little purchase. I don't have time for that. Right? Okay. Well, if that's the case, then uh, one thing that really is almost like a cheat code in purchasing is thrifting, right? Buying at a secondhand store, especially if that secondhand store is a nonprofit and it uses the resources for community enrichment. It's largely an ethical purchase, even if it's from a brand that's not the most ethical company. But even if it's a purchase of a brand that is not known to be ethical, uh, because you're extending the life of a product that was discarded, right? You're reusing what was once discarded, and by that fact alone, that purchase, you can consider it an ethical purchase. Now, with the caveat of, like, you don't want to be a walking advertisement for a company that isn't very ethical. But that aside, your shortcut to not have to do a lot of work in your purchases is go to a secondhand store. So, to summarize what we've said so far, right, Ignatian spirituality provides this principle and foundation as a mission and vision statement for any Christian. Our life goal is to live with God forever. Created things are meant to be used towards that end, and if those created things help us, great. If they make us deviate from that destination, we should probably get rid of them, or we should probably not entertain them. So the general question you should make before uh, any purchase is, will the purchase of this product help me on my pilgrimage with and to God? And then consolation and desolation. Quick summary. Consolation, you're grounded in the belovedness that God has towards you. That's awareness is a grace. It helps you make better decisions. Selfishness and insecurity can certainly sneak into your decision making while you are in consolation, but it's generally the best state out of which to make a decision. And in desolation, you're quite literally not grounded. So, therefore, your discernment is not as likely to be clear and could lead you to desire to superficially fill the void or hole that desolation brings. That's that's the short of it, right? With Ignatian spirituality and individual purchases. Now, I desire to add one last fascinating spiritual exercise from St. Ignatius's spiritual exercises that help you put the rubber to the road, as they say, right? And this exercise that Ignatius has in the second week of the spiritual exercises um, is basically like Ignatius's halftime speech for any Christian who finds themselves like a little idle in their respective pilgrimages. It's an exercise or a meditation called the three types of persons. So, in this meditation, Ignatius basically tells the story of three types of Christians in their respective spiritual pilgrimages. Uh, the first person, he says, um, is the type of person who's a lot of talk but no action. Right? This person keeps saying, "I'd like to stop being so dependent on the things which I possess and which seem to get in the way of my giving my life unreservedly to God." This type of person has all kinds of good intentions, but always remains so busy about all the things that fill up life that death finds such a one still thinking about making a bigger place for God in life. So that's the first type of person. Good intentions, a lot of talk, no action. Second type of person. This is the to do everything but the one thing necessary. So this person says, I certainly would like to be free of all attachments which get in my way of relating to God. I think maybe if I just work harder, if I say more prayers, or if I give more money to charity, that'll do it. That'll do it. This type of person will do just about anything but face the block that hinders an availability to God's gracious invitation. It is as if this person is negotiating with God, trying to buy God off. So this type may do a number of good things during life, all the time avoiding the honest way of facing the real issue. So the third type of person is to do God's will is my desire, right? This person says, I would like to be rid of any attachment which gets in the way of God's invitation to a more abundant life. I'm not sure what God is asking of me, but I want to be at a point of balance so that I can easily move in the direction of God's call. My whole effort is to be sensitive to the movements of God's grace in my life and to be ready and willing to follow God's lead. This type of person makes efforts neither to want to retain possessions nor to want to give them away unless it is for the service and praise of God. So as a result, this grace desire to be better able to serve God becomes clearly the motivating factor for accepting or letting go of anything. Now, I bring up these three types of persons because honestly, that's or what ethical purchasing is about. I'm anybody watching this webinar. Uh, it is probably not new to any of you that fast fashion, that these industries that are mostly motivated by money uh, have detrimental impacts on the earth and on people, right? Many of us know that, but it's going from knowing that to having that knowledge impact your daily life, the decisions you make, even the small decisions like your purchases, a clothing purchase, right? So I would invite certainly all of you to use those first keystones that I shared with principle and foundation and consolation and desolation, and asking yourselves questions as you're making your individual purchases. But keep in mind this really powerful meditations on the three types of persons, because I don't know about you, but for me, it's hard to change habits. If I have a particular store, a particular brand that I like, if I'm constrained by my budget, but I want to make some purchases, it's very easy to be a lot of talk but no action. It's very easy to make excuses and do everything except the one, yeah, as the second type, the one thing that's necessary, right? So I encourage you all to allow those tools of Ignatian spirituality to take you in your purchasing decisions to that third type of person, the person who is open to doing God's will and honest about, like, I don't need this, or this thing seems to be distracting me in my overall life goal of being with God and going to God. So other resources that can help you besides Ignatian spirituality in your individual purchases to learn more. You have the CEPA website, the Catholic Ethical Purchasing Alliance website, part of Ignatian Solidarity Network. And then we also have a lot of education for justice resources about ethical purchasing. We have campaigns in different liturgical moments and moments of great purchasing, like Christmas and Lent. And we have campaigns that help people be a little bit more intentional um, with how they're going about the celebration of a particular liturgical moment, which secular society has blended with purchasing and gift giving, right? And then last but not least, I mentioned it, and it's really solid. It's really clear. It helps you ask the series of questions to decide how can I go about purchasing an item, and that is the purchasing discernment flow chart. And that flow chart basically runs you through those questions and gives you the options of thinking about where you could potentially borrow something instead of buying it, where you could potentially buy it secondhand instead of buying it new. And by no means does this mean that you shouldn't buy new things. Sometimes we need new things. But this uh, webinar is an invitation for you to take that extra moment to think through the purchase, and to do that research when you can about the companies behind those products, just as Pope Francis exhorted, right? So that we are not complicit in injustice that is happening around the world, and we can be like the third person in that spiritual exercise and the three types of people, that is open to doing God's will and free of these disordered attachments that we all have and we all have to get over. So thank you for being with me as we explore Ignatian spirituality and ethical purchasing, and continue to stay tuned to the Catholic Ethical Purchasing Alliance for more tools, resources, ways to be involved, and ways to follow along as this movement grows across our Ignatian and Catholic family. Thank you.